So you got an arcade cabinet, or you got kids, or for whatever reason, you just want to boot directly to a core or game on the MiSTeR. In this video, I'm going to show you exactly how to do that. The MiSTeR has a ton of console cores, including the Atari 2600 to PlayStation and much more. But the arcade cores are very different from the consoles. And this is because the MiSTeR treats each arcade game as an individual core. And that's because each arcade has its own specific self-contained system that ran that specific game. So if you wanted to boot to an arcade or console game, there are different ways to go about it. So we'll first take a look at how to boot to an arcade game. So before we start, you'll need to make sure that your MiSTeR is on your network, and you'll need to know the IP address. You can get the IP off the main screen OSD menu. Now when we launch WinSCP, we'll use that IP address. The username will be root, and the password is the number 1. Once you log in, you're going to go ahead and go into /media/fat. And here you're going to see a MiSTeR.ini file. Go ahead and right click on that and copy and paste to make a backup. Just name it whatever you want. Always like to do a backup just in case we mess something up. Now we're going to edit the MiSTeR.ini by right clicking and then selecting edit, and I'm going to select Notepad++, but you can use whatever you like here. This file contains many options, and in this section here specifically, it has the booting options. So the description has a lot of information in it, but the boot core can be set to things like last core, last exact core, and some others. For now, I'm just going to use last core, so I'll set boot core equal to last core, and we're going to go ahead and save the file. And once you reboot your MiSTeR, it'll apply these settings and start saving the last core, so let's do that now. So the last core option will obviously boot the MiSTeR into whatever core we were playing last. So let's give it a try. I'm going to play one of my favorite arcade shooters, 1944, the Loop Master. Alright, let's go ahead and power it down, but when I power it back on, boom, as expected, 1944 boots right up. Now that's pretty cool, but it also had a 10-second countdown, and I'm not very patient, so let's go back. Now in the notes it says it can be anywhere between 10 and 30 seconds. I went all the way down to 1 second and it still worked. I tried 0, but it still delayed for 1 second, so good to know. So let's go ahead and demonstrate that, and I'm going to set this to 1 second. I'm going to save it. Now I'm going to power off the MiSTeR and power it back on. And booyah! Good times. So there are definitely some other options here that you can try, but I think personally the last core is the easiest way to boot directly to an arcade game. And it also allows you to change what your MiSTeR gets booted to simply by changing the last arcade game that you played. Now I do want to throw a warning out there, because if you exit an arcade game and you're back in the main OSD menu, yeah, the menu is now the quote-unquote last core that you were playing, and it will simply boot back to the menu. So be aware. So next, let's see how to boot directly to a console game. So booting directly to a console game is a bit different, but it can be done. And looking at the list and the sheer number of console cores, we're not going to cover every single one, but let's do the NES. And since every console is different, thankfully there is a README for each one under the Media, FAT, Docs directory. So if I go into the NES folder, and I can right click on this file, I'm going to open up this README. And it says to automatically boot a game in the NES, we need to name that game to boot1.rom. So let's take a look at all my ROMs for the NES, and I'm going to pick one of my first NES games, Baseball, and let's just rename this to boot1.rom. So there are a couple things to remember though as I'm doing this. First, you cannot use zip files. I tried to do it and it just wouldn't work. It has to be the actual ROM file, it can't be compressed. 2, I learned that you can also just make a copy of the ROM file and you can rename that copy to boot1.rom. And this was actually a much better idea because afterwards I was a little confused. I was like, wait a minute, what ROM is this that I named to boot1.rom? So making a copy is easier, but I did the first way just so that I could show you that it works. So I've unzipped my Baseball ROM and now I have the actual ROM file, and I'm going to go ahead and rename this as boot1.rom. And to make sure the NES is the last core, we're going to go ahead and launch that before we power off. Hey, power it up and boom, goes right to the NES and Baseball is the one that loads up. Very cool. So there you go guys, that's how you boot up your MiSTeR into either an arcade ROM or a console ROM. So if you want to do any of the other consoles, just go through the README and see what the file has to be named, as the arcade is pretty simple and straightforward. Well, it's been a fun one guys. Thanks for joining me on this video. Hopefully it helped. Post your questions below if you got them. Until next time, see ya.